Parents kicked me out at 18, leaving me homeless. Years later they broke into my house to squat while I was away. I'm 30-year-old male, and my parents didn't really want kids. I was an only child, and pretty much an accidental pregnancy from what relatives have told me, as my parents claimed that they were going to be child-free when they married. My childhood was initially good, but I think after I started growing out of the cute and adorable phase, my parents were less inclined to spend time with me. They both worked, and had their own business that they started together. That business was their life, and I was always second fiddle to it. Any other close members of family like my grandparents lived states away, and I barely knew anything about them till I was an adult. So I had no other family around my entire childhood. I was practically raised by TV and my school teachers. My own birthdays by the time I became a teenager were often spent without my parents, as they just give me some money and tell me to go out and buy whatever I wanted. It was more or less the same with Christmas, and sometimes even back to school shopping. We wouldn't have even had a Christmas tree after I turned 10 if it weren't for the fact I convinced my parents to buy a fake one I could build up and then take apart later every year. If I were to describe my parents, think of them as those people who always wear black, drink lots of wine, and look down their noses at people. And the last I saw of my parents, they still looked and acted the same way. Although my father was always wearing a toupee now. When I turned 16 I asked my parents if I could work part-time for them at their business, and they just told me they had no open positions or anything like that. They may as well have just come right out and said they didn't want me there. After I turned 18 my parents told me that since I was an adult, they expected me to move out as soon as I was able. I was working part-time because I was still in high school, and I didn't have anywhere near enough saved for college. And not long after high school ended my parents told me to pack up and move out. They got an official eviction notice that gave me 30 days and everything. They didn't even help me move. I had to get help from a friend's dad who owns a truck. I ended up renting a crappy apartment and working retail. I had no real life experience and no time for college. Then after just a few months I got fired because my manager legitimately had it out for me and wrote me up for the stupidest things. I don't even remember what they were anymore. But I wasn't the only one the manager treated that way. I called corporate about it, and so did a few other people. Corporate looked into the manager, and they were soon fired for various reasons. Not many of which I actually know, since it was mostly kept quiet. But someone told me theft of cigarettes was a part of it, and the manager was a chain smoker. Corporate refused to rehire me and only said that they'd change the record to say I was laid off instead of terminated so my resume would still be clean. Guess they considered me damaged goods or something. I ended up going broke pretty fast because I was terrible at managing my own money and couldn't find steady employment. So I lost my apartment. I went back to my parents begging for help, but they refused to take me in, not even for a little while to get back on my feet. I ended up homeless and living out of a tent in someone's backyard. In winter, my friends had all moved on to college, some in other states, and I was a broke kid taking whatever work I could to stay alive. My salvation came when one of the neighbors of my parents found out I was living out of a tent and offered to take me in for a little while so I wouldn't freeze. She helped me badger my parents into telling me how to get in touch with the other members of my estranged family. My parents did not want to say. My guess is out of fear of being judged for throwing their son out the way they did, but they coughed up the info and gave me a list of contact details, and then told me not to bother them ever again. I called my grandparents from my father's side of the family, and they were very surprised and happy to hear from me because they hadn't seen me since I was an infant, and I'm their only grandchild. My grandparents, after finding out my situation, flew me over to live with them as soon as they could. They basically adopted me. My parents didn't even see me off at the airport despite being invited to. I had zero contact with them for pretty much a decade. My grandparents said they despised my parents for treating me so poorly, and legally disowned them by striking them from their wills. My parents, I'm told, were not happy to hear that, but also said it didn't really matter because they were plenty well off and didn't need anything from my grandparents. How wrong that statement turned out to be. After about a year of living with my grandparents I was able to afford to start going to community college. I got an associate's degree, got a decent job thanks to a recommendation from my grandpa, and eventually my grandparents offered to sell me their house so they could retire to Arizona. My grandma wanted to live in a warmer climate as the cold winter was getting harder and harder on her health every year. I was sad to see them go, but I happily bought the house. They sold it to me for 1/3 its value, and I'll have it paid off in a few more years. My job is me going away on the road periodically, so I can end up away from home for weeks at a time. Not that I mind the travel. I have no pets or a girlfriend, or anything like that. I wouldn't have time for them right now, but in a few years when I have some things in order I'll make time. I don't want to stay a lonely bachelor forever. Then one day in late 2020 I came home after being away for over 2 weeks, only to find a large white van I did not recognize in my driveway. I was getting ready to call police when I noticed the van had the logo from my parents' business on the side of it, and I felt dread. Yes, my parents were there. They'd broken in somehow and were living out of my home, and they had the nerve to greet me like we were buddy or buddy the moment I walked in. I told them to get the hell out, and they refused because it was grandma and grandpa's house. I said it wasn't their house anymore. They'd sold it to me when they retired. They'd have known that if they were in any way involved with my life, but they threw me to the wolves 10 years prior with no life experience. We argued and they refused to leave. My father told me it was his parents' house first, and that meant he and my mother had the right to live there if they wanted. I walked right into my bedroom, locked the door and called the police. When the cops showed up they were of no help. My parents claimed to them that they had already been there long enough to have residency, which was a complete lie, but I had no cameras to prove they weren't there a month. My neighbors had no cameras either, so it was my word against my parents over how long they'd really been there, and they were claiming squatters' rights. They told police they had a verbal rental agreement with me, and that I was trying to illegally evict them for no reason. My mother even put on the waterworks when saying that. The police told me it was a family dispute, and to file eviction with the courts to get them out, and this was in 2020. Getting to court for anything took longer because of the pandemic. Meanwhile my parents are squatting in my house rent-free and rubbing it in my face. From the information I got out of them, their business went bankrupt and they sold off almost everything they had to pay their debts. All they had left was the van and a few personal belongings. So they expected to live in my house rent-free for the foreseeable future. They were working too. Both of them soon got new jobs. My father as a delivery driver, my mother as a sales associate. They were making money, and the only things they contributed to was electricity and water utilities, which was basically just handing me a $100 bill every month and saying I should be grateful they were paying me anything. Anytime I tried to discuss proper rent with them, they just said I owed it to them to live rent-free because I took 18 years of their lives, and it's not like they were demanding the money back for that time. Then threatened to stop helping with the utilities altogether. I was so at my wit's end that I ended up calling my grandparents to explain the situation to them. They were very unhappy, and spoke with my parents, but my parents still said they had the right to stay in my home, and refused to budge. My grandpa told me he was sorry it'd come to this, and that if they hadn't sold me the house, my parents wouldn't have invaded. I told him not to worry, I'd already filed for a legal eviction, and would get it soon enough, and my parents already knew that they were on borrowed time. I made sure to say that in earshot of my parents too. They responded with the silent treatment. My father was away most of the time driving a delivery vehicle 6 days a week, which was a job really not to his liking. And my mother basically tried to take over my house in her spare time. She demanded I let her rearrange my living room, and even tried to force me to give her and my father the master bedroom, because they were my parents, and they deserved better, as she put it. I vetoed both of those things and said they don't deserve better, and to stop trying to act like I owe them anything. I didn't ask to be born, and it's a normal obligation for parents to raise their own children, and all they were doing was trying to assert dominance to try and keep me from kicking them out. Finally, after 4 months and now into early 2021, I managed to take my parents to court over their squatting. We only needed to go to court because they fought the eviction and tried to gaslight me into rescinding it. They tried to use the fact it was formerly my grandparents' house, and the fact that they were giving me $100 a month as some sort of leverage of residency. But there was no real rental agreement, and they were smart enough not to try and forge one, as that would have been fraud. So the judge ordered that they needed to be out in a maximum of 30 days because they had zero claim on my house. After court they confronted me and said they were disappointed in me for kicking out my own flesh and blood. I couldn't help but laugh and called them hypocrites because that's exactly what they did to me without a care in the world for my well-being. They had no love for me, so I have no love for them. I owed them nothing. They just tried to act like everything that was mine is theirs. But they had no right to call themselves my parents because they've never really acted like it. I called them a pair of snobby lying narcissists to their faces, and told them to get their affairs in order, because they already know I won't hesitate to call police if they don't leave my house when the 30 days are over. My father looked enraged, but my mother stopped him from saying or doing anything by grabbing his shoulder and shaking her head. He sneered at me and walked away. They left, but not without a lot of tension. That final month was spent with them either guilting me to try and make me change my mind, or completely ignoring me. I put up a calendar in the living room and checked off each day before they had to leave with a red marker, and the exact day they were to be out was marked with a big red circle. I still remember that final day was March 2nd. My parents waited until the exact day they had to leave my home for good before they finally left, even when all their stuff was out of the house and they were sleeping on the floor in the guest room for a few days. Since they were so convinced they could make me let them stay, they didn't bother to try and look for an apartment until after the court eviction went through, and my mother spent weeks scrambling to find an apartment. They had to get a tiny and crappy studio apartment in the next city over because it was the only thing they could find on such short notice. A lot like what I had to do when I was 18. Quite ironic.